I worked at my restaurant for a long time, 11 years behind the same steel counter, just going through the motions after my wife died. Then one day, this tiny 9-year-old girl appeared at my back door. Maya. She was asking for scraps, soaking wet from the rain. What I did for her that day changed both our lives completely. Sometimes the people we save end up saving us.
I had been standing behind the same steel counter for 11 years when she appeared at the back door of Rosie's diner, and I still remember the way the rain had been falling for 3 days straight, like the sky itself was grieving, and how the water pooled in the alley where the asphalt had cracked from too many winters of freezing and thawing and breaking apart, the way everything eventually breaks apart if you wait long enough and watch closely enough to see the hairline fractures that appear before the final collapse. The morning had started wrong from the moment I opened my eyes in the apartment that still smelled like Rebecca's lavender soap, even though she had been dead for 2 years and 4 months and 16 days. Not that I was counting, but that I couldn't stop counting, the way you can't stop touching a bruise to see if it still hurts, and it always still hurts, but you keep touching it anyway because the pain has become familiar, and familiar pain feels safer than the unknown territories that lie beyond grief and into whatever comes after grief, if anything comes after grief, which I was beginning to doubt. I had burned the first batch of hash browns because I was thinking about the dream I'd had the night before, where Rebecca was standing in our old kitchen making coffee in the blue ceramic pot that I had thrown away 6 months after the funeral because seeing it every morning felt like being stabbed with a dull knife over and over again. And in the dream she was trying to tell me something important, but every time she opened her mouth the sound of the coffee percolator would drown out her words, and I would wake up with my heart pounding and my sheets soaked with sweat and the taste of regret thick on my tongue, like I had been chewing on copper pennies all night. The second batch of hash browns had burned too because Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for scrambled eggs and wheat toast, had started crying into her coffee cup for no reason that she could explain, except to say that sometimes the sadness just comes over you like a wave and you either ride it out or you drown. And I had stood there with the spatula in my hand watching this 78-year-old woman weep into her breakfast and thinking about how grief is contagious and how maybe that's why I had been avoiding people for so long, because I was afraid that my sadness would leak out and contaminate everyone around me the way toxic waste seeps into groundwater and poisons everything it touches. Sally, the waitress who had been working at Rosie's since before I was born, had taken one look at Mrs. Patterson and then at me and had shaken her head with the expression of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty to be surprised by it anymore, but not so much that she had stopped caring entirely. And she had sat down next to Mrs. Patterson and held her hand while she cried, and I had gone back to the grill and tried to focus on the simple mechanics of cooking food and not burning it, but my hands were shaking and the spatula felt foreign and clumsy, like I was operating someone else's body with faulty instructions and no practice manual. By 10 o'clock the rain was coming down harder, and the few customers who had braved the weather were sitting in their booths with the hunched shoulders and distant expressions of people who were waiting for storms to pass both outside and inside themselves, and I was standing at the industrial sink washing the same plate over and over again, because washing dishes had become a kind of meditation for me in those days when thinking felt dangerous and feeling felt impossible, and the repetitive motion of scrubbing and rinsing and drying gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to find a safe place to land in the wreckage of everything I had lost. That's when I heard the knocking, soft at first like someone who wasn't sure they deserved to be heard, then more insistent but still polite, the way someone knocks when they know they're asking for something they have no right to expect, but they're asking anyway because desperation makes beggars of us all and pride becomes a luxury that not everyone can afford. Through the screen door clouded with rain and time I could see a small figure standing in the alley, and at first I thought it might be a hallucination, because grief does things to your perception and makes you see things that aren't there and miss things that are, and I had been living in that liminal space between reality and memory for so long that the boundaries had become blurred and unreliable. But then she knocked again and I realized she was real, this little girl who couldn't have been more than 9 years old, standing in the rain with water dripping from hair that had been cut with scissors that were either very dull or wielded by hands that were shaking too much to cut straight, and her clothes were soaked through and clinging to a frame that was too thin and too fragile, like a bird that had fallen from its nest too early and was trying to survive in a world that wasn't designed for creatures so small and vulnerable and alone. "Excuse me, sir," she said when I opened the door, and her voice was barely audible over the sound of rain hitting the metal roof of the diner and the distant rumble of traffic on streets that were slick with water and oil and the accumulated grime of a city that had seen too many storms and not enough sunshine, and I realized I had been staring at her without speaking for long enough that she was starting to look afraid, not of me exactly but of the possibility that I might close the door and leave her standing there in the rain with nowhere to go and no one to ask for help. "Do you have any food you're throwing away?" she asked, and then quickly added, "I don't need much, just whatever you can't use," and there was something in the way she phrased it that suggested she had asked this question before and had learned through experience that humility and low expectations were more likely to yield results than direct requests or expressions of genuine need, and I felt something twist in my stomach like a knife being turned, because I recognized in her voice the same careful politeness that I had perfected in the months after Rebecca died, when people would ask how I was doing and I would say fine, just fine, thanks for asking, because the truth was too complicated, and too painful, and too likely to make other people uncomfortable. She was shivering, and I could see that her sneakers were held together with duct tape that had turned gray from too much contact with wet pavement, and there were holes in the soles that would let in water and cold and everything else that the world wanted to pour into the spaces where protection should have been but wasn't, and her jacket was too big for her small shoulders and hung on her like a tent that someone had tried to use as clothing, and I wondered how long she had been wandering the streets in weather like this, and where she had slept the night before, and whether there was anyone in the world who was looking for her or worried about her or even knew that she existed. "What's your name?" I asked, and she hesitated for a moment, as if giving her name might somehow make her more vulnerable than she already was, or as if she had learned that adults who ask for your name are sometimes the ones you need to be most careful around, and then she said, "Maya," in a voice that was trying to be brave but was betrayed by the slight tremor that suggested she was more scared than she wanted to admit, and when she added, "Maya Johnson," I could hear in those two words the echo of someone who had been taught that proper introductions mattered and that politeness was a kind of armor that might protect you when nothing else would. I told her my name was David and asked if she was hungry, and she nodded once quickly and then looked down at her feet as if admitting hunger was something shameful that needed to be acknowledged and then hidden away, and I realized that she was probably no older than my niece Sarah, who lived 3 states away with my sister and her husband in a house with a yard and a dog, and parents who worried about things like homework and bedtimes and whether she was eating enough vegetables. And here was this child who looked like she could be Sarah's sister asking strangers for scraps of food because there was no one else to ask and nowhere else to turn. "Wait here," I said, and went back inside, where the familiar sounds of the lunch rush were beginning to build, even though it was still early, because people tend to seek comfort in warm, dry places when the world outside feels cold and hostile and unpredictable. And Sally was refilling coffee cups with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to be invisible while being essential, and she looked at me with raised eyebrows when I started piling food onto a paper plate with the kind of careful attention I usually reserved for paying customers. "You feeding strays now?" she asked, but not unkindly, and I shook my head and said, "Something like that," and she nodded and didn't ask more questions, because Sally understood that sometimes the most important acts of kindness are the ones that don't require explanations or justifications or any of the complicated moral arithmetic that people use to decide who deserves help and who doesn't, and why and how much and under what circumstances. I made Maya a sandwich with thick slices of turkey and cheese on bread that was still warm from the oven, and added a container of soup that had been simmering since morning, filling the kitchen with the smell of chicken and vegetables and herbs and comfort, and I included a plastic cup filled with milk that was cold enough to fog the sides, and a packet of crackers and an apple that was red and perfect and unblemished. And when I carried it all outside, Maya was still standing exactly where I had left her, even though the rain was coming down harder now and she was getting soaked, and I realized she hadn't moved because she was afraid that if she left her post I might forget about her or change my mind or decide that she wasn't worth the trouble after all. She accepted the food with both hands and said, "Thank you," in a voice that carried more weight than those 2 words should have been able to bear, and I watched her look around for a place to sit that might offer some protection from the rain, and when she couldn't find any she settled down on the concrete steps that led to the alley, even though they were wet and cold and would soak through her clothes and make her even more miserable than she already was. But she didn't complain or ask for anything else. She just sat down and began eating with the careful deliberation of someone who knew that this meal needed to last and that the next one was not guaranteed. The way she ate reminded me of myself in the weeks after Rebecca's funeral, when every bite of food felt like an act of betrayal against a grief that insisted I didn't deserve nourishment or comfort or any of the small pleasures that make life bearable, and I had to force myself to eat because people kept bringing casseroles and saying things like, "You need to keep your strength up," and "Rebecca wouldn't want you to waste away," as if they knew what Rebecca would have wanted, as if anyone could know what the dead want from the living except maybe to be remembered with love instead of guilt, and to have their absence mourned without the mourning becoming a kind of prison that traps the survivors in amber and prevents them from ever moving forward. I should have gone back inside then, because there were orders to fill and customers to serve and a business to run, but instead I found myself standing in the doorway watching Maya eat and thinking about all the ways that hunger manifests itself in the world, and how sometimes the most profound starvation has nothing to do with food and everything to do with the absence of someone who sees you as worthy of care and attention and love, and how we are all walking around carrying empty spaces inside ourselves where something essential used to be, and how most of the time we pretend those spaces don't exist because acknowledging them would require us to admit how fragile and incomplete and desperately in need we all are. Maya ate slowly and methodically, and when she finished she folded the paper plate in half and put it in her pocket along with the plastic spoon and the empty milk cup, and I realized she was saving them not just for later use but as evidence that this had really happened, that someone had seen her and fed her and treated her with dignity and kindness, and that maybe if she held on to these small tokens she could convince herself that she wasn't completely invisible and forgotten and alone in a world that seemed designed to grind up anyone who wasn't strong enough or fast enough or lucky enough to stay ahead of the grinding. "That was really good," she said when she noticed me watching, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was not just talking about the food but about the entire experience of being seen and acknowledged and treated like a human being deserving of basic consideration and care. And I nodded and asked if she lived nearby, and she pointed vaguely toward the east, where the downtown gave way to a collection of abandoned buildings and empty lots that had once been someone's vision of urban renewal but had become instead a kind of no man's land where people went when they had run out of other places to go and other options to try. "With your family?" I asked, and she shook her head and said, "Just me," and the way she said it made me understand that the story of how she had come to be just her was probably long and complicated and painful, and not something she was going to share with a stranger who had given her one meal and asked a few questions. And I felt something shift inside my chest, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for too long, and I realized that Maya's aloneness was different from my own but equally profound, and that we were both carrying versions of the same burden, just wrapped in different packaging and worn in different ways and expressed through different strategies for survival. The rain was still falling and Maya was still shivering, and I could see that her lips were starting to turn blue from the cold, and that her small body was working harder and harder to generate enough heat to keep her vital organs functioning. And I made a decision that surprised me with its suddenness and clarity, because I had been living in a fog of indecision for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to know with certainty what needed to be done, and to do it without second-guessing or analyzing or waiting for permission from some internal authority that had been silent for months. "Come inside," I said, and Maya looked at me with surprise and something that might have been fear, because she had learned to be suspicious of adults who offered things that seemed too good to be true, and I could see her trying to calculate whether accepting my invitation would put her in more danger than staying outside in the rain and cold, and I realized that this was the kind of calculation that no 9-year-old should ever have to make, and that the fact that she was making it at all said something terrible about the world we had created and the way we failed to protect the people who needed protection most. "Just until the rain stops," I said, and she nodded slowly and followed me inside, where the warmth hit her like a physical force, and I could see her body begin to relax for the first time since she had appeared at my door. And Sally looked up from wiping down tables and saw Maya standing there dripping wet and obviously homeless, and instead of saying anything judgmental or unwelcoming, she went to the supply closet and brought back a stack of clean towels and handed them to Maya with the same matter-of-fact kindness she showed to paying customers. And I realized that Sally understood something important about human dignity and the way small gestures can restore a person's faith in the possibility that the world might contain more kindness than cruelty if you know where to look for it. Maya dried her hair and her face and her hands with careful attention to each finger, and I could see that she was trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible because she didn't want to be a burden or take up too much space or do anything that might make me regret my decision to let her come inside, and I wanted to tell her that she didn't need to worry about being a burden because I was carrying so much weight already that one small girl wasn't going to make any noticeable difference, but I didn't know how to say that without sounding either patronizing or crazy, so instead I just asked if she wanted some hot chocolate and watched her face light up with an expression of pure joy that was so unexpected and so beautiful that I felt something crack open inside my chest like ice breaking up on a river in spring. I made the hot chocolate with real milk and real chocolate and a touch of vanilla the way Rebecca used to make it for me when I came home from work on cold nights feeling beaten down by the endless repetition of tasks that seemed to have no meaning beyond the paycheck they generated, and as I stirred the mixture and watched it turn smooth and rich and comforting, I could almost hear Rebecca's voice saying, "A little sweetness makes everything better," and for the first time in 2 years and 4 months and 16 days I felt like maybe she was right and maybe there was still room in my life for sweetness and comfort and the kind of small pleasures that don't solve anything fundamental but make the unsolvable things a little easier to bear. Maya wrapped her small hands around the mug and breathed in the steam and took tiny sips like she was trying to make the hot chocolate last as long as possible, and I sat down across from her at one of the back booths where we could talk without being overheard by other customers, and I asked her how long she had been living on the streets, and she looked down into her mug and said, "Since summer," and I did the math and realized that meant she had been homeless for at least 4 months, which seemed impossible because how does a 9-year-old survive 4 months on the streets of a city like this, and where were the social workers and the police and all the systems that were supposed to catch children before they fell this far through the cracks? "What happened to your parents?" I asked, and immediately regretted the question because I could see her shrink back into herself like she was trying to disappear, and I realized that whatever had happened was probably too terrible and too complicated to explain to a stranger over hot chocolate in a diner, and that pushing for details would only make her feel more exposed and vulnerable than she already was, so I said, "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," and she looked up at me with gratitude and relief and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely a whisper. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain on the windows and the sound of other people's conversations and the familiar rhythm of a restaurant in motion, and I found myself thinking about how strange it was that two broken people could sit across from each other and find in their shared brokenness a kind of peace that neither had been able to find alone, and how sometimes the most profound connections happen not because people have everything in common but because they understand each other's particular flavor of pain and isolation and need. Maya finished her hot chocolate and asked if she could use the bathroom, and I pointed her toward the back of the restaurant and watched her walk away with the careful steps of someone who was still adjusting to being warm and dry and safe, and when she came back her face was cleaner and her hair was neater and she looked a little less like a refugee from a war zone and a little more like what she actually was, which was a child who deserved to be protected and cared for and loved regardless of whatever circumstances had brought her to my door on this rainy Tuesday morning. "The rain stopped," she said, and I looked out the window and saw that she was right and that the sun was trying to break through the clouds like hope trying to break through despair, and I realized that our time together was coming to an end and that soon she would have to go back outside and face whatever dangers and difficulties were waiting for her in the world beyond these walls, and the thought of that made me feel sick with worry and helplessness and a kind of rage at the universe for creating a system where children could fall through the cracks and disappear and suffer and die without anyone being held accountable. "Will you come back tomorrow?" I asked, and Maya looked at me with surprise as if the idea that someone might want to see her again was so foreign that she needed time to process it, and then she nodded slowly and said, "If that's okay," and I told her it was more than okay and that I would save her something good, and she smiled for the first time since she had appeared at my door, and her smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm, and I realized that I had also smiled for the first time in longer than I could remember, and that maybe Rebecca had been right about sweetness making everything better even if it didn't make everything okay. Maya didn't come back the next day, and by 4 o'clock, when the afternoon shift was winding down and the last of the lunch customers had paid their checks and wandered back into their lives, I was standing at the back door looking out into the alley where puddles from yesterday's rain still reflected pieces of gray sky, and wondering if I had Imagine the whole encounter, or if something terrible had happened to her during the night when the temperature dropped below freezing and the city became a place where small bodies could simply stop working and be found days later by maintenance workers or never be found at all, just added to the statistics of people who disappear without anyone noticing or caring or filing missing person reports. I had dreamed about her the night before, but not the way I usually dreamed about Rebecca, with that mixture of longing and guilt and the desperate hope that this time the dream would be different and she would stay and we would have more time to say the things we never got to say when she was dying in the hospital bed with tubes in her arms and machines monitoring the gradual failure of organs that had carried her through 34 years of life before betraying her in ways that medicine could measure but not prevent or reverse or explain in any terms that made sense to someone who loved her. No, this dream about Maya was different, darker, and filled with the kind of terror that comes from knowing that somewhere in the world a child is cold and hungry and afraid, and there's nothing you can do about it because you don't know where she is or how to find her or whether she's even still alive. And in the dream I was running through empty streets calling her name, but my voice made no sound, and the streets kept changing direction like a maze designed by someone who understood that the cruelest punishment is hope, followed by disappointment, followed by the gradual erosion of the belief that anything you do matters in the face of forces so much larger and more powerful than your individual capacity to make a difference. Sally had noticed me checking the door every few minutes and had finally asked if I was expecting someone, and I had said, maybe, without explaining, because how do you explain that a 9-year-old homeless girl had become the focal point of your day and that her absence felt like a physical weight pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe or concentrate or do any of the routine tasks that usually filled the empty spaces where meaningful purpose should have been but wasn't and had never been, even before Rebecca died and left me with the clear understanding that my life had been mostly marking time until she arrived to give it shape and meaning and direction. The lunch rush had been brutal, not because we were particularly busy but because every customer seemed to be carrying their own version of barely contained crisis, and the air in the diner felt thick with the accumulated weight of people who were hanging on by threads that were fraying faster than they could be rewoven. And Mrs. Patterson had come in again, and this time she hadn't just cried into her coffee. She had told me about her son who had died of an overdose 3 months ago, and how she kept making his favorite breakfast every morning before remembering that he wasn't coming home, and how the eggs would sit there getting cold while she sat at her kitchen table staring at the empty chair where he used to sit and read the sports section and complain about the local team's pitching rotation. "You know what the worst part is?" she had said while I stood there with a dish rag in my hands, feeling completely inadequate to deal with the magnitude of her grief but unable to walk away, because walking away would have been another small act of abandonment in a world that was already full of too many small acts of abandonment. "The worst part is that everyone expects you to get over it, to move on, to find closure, as if love was something you could just turn off like a faucet when it becomes inconvenient or socially awkward, and they don't understand that grief isn't something you recover from, it's something you learn to carry, and some days the weight is manageable and some days it feels like it's going to crush you, but you keep carrying it because the alternative is forgetting, and forgetting feels like killing them all over again." I had nodded and said something about how grief was different for everyone and how there was no timeline for healing, and other platitudes that sounded hollow even as I spoke them, because what I really wanted to say was that I understood exactly what she meant about the weight and the carrying and the fear of forgetting, and how sometimes the pain was the only proof you had left that the love had been real, and that the person who died had mattered enough to leave a hole in the world that couldn't be filled by anything else, no matter how hard well-meaning people try to convince you that time heals all wounds, when what time actually does is teach you how to live with wounds that never fully heal. They just become part of the landscape of who you are. By 5 o'clock I had convinced myself that Maya was dead, and that my brief encounter with her had been nothing more than a cruel reminder of my own powerlessness to protect anyone from anything, and I was getting ready to close the kitchen when I heard that same soft knocking on the back door, and when I opened it, there she was standing in the alley wearing different clothes that were still too big and still obviously secondhand but cleaner than yesterday, and her hair had been washed and braided with the kind of care that suggested someone had helped her, or at least that she had found access to soap and water and a mirror and enough time to make herself presentable. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, as if we had an appointment, as if her presence in my life was something I had a right to expect rather than an unexpected gift that I had no idea how to deserve or repay. And I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long, and I realized that I had been holding my breath since yesterday afternoon, waiting for this moment, without admitting to myself that I was waiting, or that it mattered this much, or that the absence of one small girl could create such a large hole in a day that should have been like every other day, indistinguishable and forgettable and unremarkable. "You're not late," I said, and opened the door wider, and she came inside without hesitation this time, as if the ritual of yesterday had established some kind of trust or understanding between us. And I asked if she was hungry, and she nodded, but not with the desperate urgency of yesterday, more like someone who knew that food would be provided and that she didn't have to worry about going to sleep with an empty stomach, at least not tonight. And I realized that this small shift in her expectation represented something enormous in terms of what it meant to feel safe enough to assume that tomorrow might contain the same kindness as today. I made her another sandwich and soup, and this time I added a slice of pie that had been left over from the lunch special, because everyone deserves dessert, especially children who have been forced to grow up too fast and shoulder responsibilities that should have been carried by adults who were either absent or unable or unwilling to do the basic work of protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that innocence has time to exist before it gets stripped away by circumstances that no child should have to navigate alone. "Where did you sleep last night?" I asked, and immediately wished I hadn't, because the question felt too intrusive, too much like the kind of interrogation that adults inflict on children when they're trying to decide whether to help or call the authorities or mind their own business and pretend they never saw anything that might require them to get involved in situations that are messy and complicated and resistant to simple solutions. But Maya didn't seem offended by the question. She just said, "There's a place under the bridge where it stays dry, and some of the other people share blankets when it gets really cold." And the casual way she said it made me understand that sleeping under bridges was normal for her now that she had developed survival strategies and social networks that most adults never have to think about, and that her childhood had been replaced by a kind of premature competence that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "Other people?" I asked, and she nodded and said, "Mostly grown-ups, but there's a few kids too, and everyone looks out for everyone else, mostly because if you don't look out for each other then nobody else will, and you learn pretty quick that the world is full of people who will step over you if you're lying on the sidewalk, but very few people who will stop to see if you need help getting back up." The matter-of-fact way she described this parallel universe of people who lived in the spaces between the official world made me realize how much suffering was happening just outside the edges of my awareness, and how easy it was to go through life without seeing the people who had fallen through the cracks or been pushed out of the systems that were supposed to catch them and hold them and help them find their way back to stability and safety in something that resembled a normal life. "What about school?" I asked, and Maya looked down at her hands and said, "I used to go to school," and the past tense of that statement contained so much loss and interrupted possibility that I felt angry at whatever series of failures had led to a situation where a 9-year-old girl was choosing between education and survival, and apparently survival was winning, because survival always wins when those are the only two options available. "Do you miss it?" I asked, and she nodded and said, "I was good at reading, and I liked my teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, and she used to let me help her organize the classroom library, and she said I had potential and that I could be anything I wanted to be when I grew up." And then she looked up at me with eyes that were too old for her face and said, "But that was before," and she didn't need to explain what before meant, because we all have our befores and afters, and the line between them is usually marked by something so devastating that it divides your life into two completely different stories: the one you were living before everything changed, and the one you're trying to survive after everything fell apart. I wanted to ask what had happened to bring her from a classroom where a teacher saw potential in her to an alley where she was asking strangers for leftover food, but I could see that the question would require her to revisit whatever trauma had destroyed her normal childhood and replaced it with this premature expertise in survival, and I didn't have the right to ask her to carry that weight just to satisfy my curiosity about how children end up homeless in a country that supposedly has systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. Instead, I asked if she would like to help me close the kitchen, and she nodded eagerly, as if being useful was something she craved more than food or warmth or any of the other obvious needs that had brought her to my door. And I realized that dignity was probably as important to her as physical survival, and that being treated like someone whose help was valuable rather than someone who was just a recipient of charity might be the closest thing to medicine I could offer for whatever wounds were still bleeding inside her small, tough, resilient body. She helped me wipe down the counters and organize the walk-in cooler and wash the last of the dishes, and she worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every task completed correctly was a small victory against the chaos that had taken over her life. And I found myself thinking about how work can be a form of prayer when it's done with attention and care, and how there was something almost sacred about the way Maya approached even the simplest jobs, as if she were building something important rather than just cleaning up after other people's meals. "My mom used to work in a restaurant," she said while we were stacking clean plates, and I felt my heart stop because this was the first time she had mentioned her mother, and I didn't know whether the past tense meant that her mother was dead or just gone or transformed into someone who was no longer capable of being a mother. And I waited for her to say more, but she didn't, and I understood that this small piece of information was probably all she was ready to share, and that pushing for more would be like trying to force open a door that was locked for good reasons. "What was she like?" I asked gently, and Maya smiled for the first time that day and said, "She was really good at making people feel welcome even when they were having the worst day of their lives, and she used to say that feeding people was a way of loving them, especially people who didn't have anyone else to love them, and she would always make sure that the portions were big enough and that everything was seasoned just right and that nobody left hungry no matter how much money they had to spend." The way Maya talked about her mother made me understand that whatever had happened to separate them, it hadn't erased the love or the lessons about kindness and hospitality and the importance of treating strangers with dignity. And I realized that Maya's politeness and gratitude weren't just survival strategies, they were inherited values that had somehow survived whatever catastrophe had destroyed the family structure that had originally contained and nurtured them. "She sounds like she was a good person," I said, and Maya nodded and said, "She was the best person," and then her face crumpled and she started crying, not the quiet tears of yesterday but deep wrenching sobs that came from a place so deep inside her that I could feel them in my own chest like an echo of every time I had cried for Rebecca and for all the things that death takes away, not just the person but the future you were supposed to have together, and all the conversations you'll never have, and all the ways they made you feel like you were worth something in a world that often makes you feel like you're not worth much at all. I didn't know what to do with a crying child because Rebecca and I had never had children, and I had never learned how to comfort someone whose pain was so much larger than their small body could contain. So I just sat down next to Maya on the floor of the kitchen and let her cry against my shoulder while I made the kind of meaningless shushing sounds that people make when they want to help but don't know how. And I thought about how grief is the same whether you're 9 or 36, and how the size of the loss isn't measured by the age of the person carrying it but by the depth of the love that created the wound in the first place. When she finally stopped crying, Maya looked up at me with red eyes and said, "I'm sorry," and I said, "You don't have to be sorry for missing someone you love," and she nodded and wiped her nose with the back of her hand and said, "Sometimes it just hits me like a wave and I can't stop it," and I said, "I know exactly what you mean, because I did," and maybe that was why we had found each other, not because either of us was looking for someone to save or be saved by, but because we both understood what it felt like to be drowning and missing someone. And sometimes drowning people can help each other float even if neither of them knows how to swim to shore. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" I asked, and she shook her head and said, "Not today, maybe someday, but not today." And I said, "That's okay, you don't ever have to tell me if you don't want to," and she looked at me with surprise as if adults who didn't demand explanations were rare in her experience, and maybe they were. Maybe most of the adults she had encountered recently had been social workers or police officers or other people whose job it was to ask questions and fill out forms and make decisions about her life without necessarily caring about what she wanted or needed or felt ready to share. We finished cleaning the kitchen in comfortable silence, and when everything was put away and the lights were turned off, Maya asked if she could come back tomorrow, and I said of course, and walked her to the back door where the evening air was cold but not cruel and the sky was clear enough to see a few stars that were brave enough to shine despite all the city lights that tried to wash them out. "Maya," I said before she left, and she turned back to look at me, and I said, "Your mother was right about feeding people being a way of loving them, and I think she would be proud of how you turned out." And Maya smiled through fresh tears and said, "Thank you, David," and then she disappeared into the alley where the shadows were gathering, and I stood in the doorway watching until I couldn't see her anymore and wondering how long a person could keep their heart breaking for other people's pain before something essential inside just gave up and stopped working altogether. That night I drove home to my empty apartment, but instead of sitting at the kitchen table staring out the window at the city lights, I went to the closet where I had stored all of Rebecca's things in boxes that I had labeled with her neat handwriting, because even after she died I couldn't bear to write her name on anything that would acknowledge her absence. And I found the box marked teaching supplies, because Rebecca had been a teacher before she got sick, and she had kept all her books and lesson plans and art supplies even after she was too weak to go back to work, because she said maybe someday she would feel strong enough to teach again, and hope was more important than realism when you were fighting for your life. I opened the box and found workbooks for 3rd grade reading and math and science, and a set of colored pencils that had never been used, and flashcards for multiplication tables and phonics and geography, and I realized that these supplies could give Maya something that sleeping under bridges and surviving on restaurant scraps couldn't give her, which was a connection to the future she had been forced to abandon when whatever happened and her normal childhood ended and her education stopped and her potential got buried under the immediate demands of staying alive one day at a time. I spent the rest of the evening organizing the materials into a curriculum that might help Maya catch up to where she should have been if the world had been kinder to her, and as I worked I could almost feel Rebecca's presence in the room, not as a ghost or a hallucination, but as an approval of this use of her things for something that mattered. Something that honored her belief that every child deserved a chance to learn and grow and become whoever they were meant to become, regardless of the circumstances that had shaped their early years. For the first time since Rebecca died, I went to bed feeling like I had done something that might make a difference in the world, and when I woke up the next morning I was looking forward to the day, not because it would be easy or pleasant, but because it would contain Maya and the possibility of giving her something that no one could take away from her once she had it, which was knowledge and the tools to build a different kind of future than the one that seemed to be waiting for her if nobody intervened and offered her alternatives to the trajectory that poverty and abandonment had set in motion.